They called themselves the Arbiters of Order, a council of ancient species bound by treaties and customs older than our recorded history. They sat in their high towers, trading decrees as though they were universal law, and expected every new civilization to bow without hesitation. When they turned their attention toward us, they carried the same smug certainty that had worked on countless others. In their eyes, Earth's children were a frontier species, provincial and eager for recognition, easily cowed by threats dressed in the language of diplomacy. What they did not realize was that they had misread the nature of their newest rival. Their first approach was soft, practiced like a ritual. Offers of trade wrapped around quiet warnings. Promises of protection paired with conditions that stripped sovereignty. When those failed to gain traction, the mask of benevolence slipped. Embargoes followed. Trade lanes closed with the stroke of an alien signature. They announced sanctions in polished chambers, their voices cold and detached, as if our fate was already sealed. To them, it was routine. To us, it was the first taste of an insult that could never be forgotten. They saw our colonies scattered on the edges of charted space and judged us weak. They looked at the steel skeletons of half-built orbital stations and assumed they had found a race still struggling with basics. They measured our fleets by tonnage and found nothing worth fearing. What their eyes failed to notice were the details that told another story. The way our ships carried redundancies woven into every frame, the way our colonies could operate with bare minimum supplies, the way our engineers solved scarcity with ingenuity instead of begging for charity. To them, those were signs of backwardness. In truth, they were the fingerprints of a species honed by hardship. For generations, humanity had survived crises that could have broken empires. We had clawed through famine, pestilence, environmental collapse, and wars that scarred continents. Each time, we rose again, tempered and sharper. When resources failed, we learned efficiency. When disease struck, we invented cures under fire. When enemies tried to erase us, we adapted until we stood over the ruins of their ambition. That history was invisible to the Council, but it lived in our blood. We carried it with us into the void, unseen but never absent. Their envoys arrived with declarations that sounded like ultimatums disguised as contracts. They spoke of contributions. We were required to pay for the privilege of joining their collective. They demanded quotas of materials, access to our genetic databanks, and the dismantling of destabilizing weapons. Behind their flowery phrases, the meaning was simple: tribute, obedience, submission. The Council believed themselves subtle, but to us the words rang clear as chains. Even then, our first responses were measured. We answered with courtesy, with offers of fair trade and shared research. We thought perhaps arrogance could be tempered by dialogue. That courtesy was interpreted as weakness. Their messages grew sharper, their patience thinner, their arrogance more pronounced. They believed they were tightening the leash, but all they were doing was giving us the space to prepare. The Council had grown used to dealing with species that folded quickly. They had perfected intimidation into an art. Entire civilizations had vanished into the machinery of their governance, identities erased in the name of order. What they never encountered was a civilization that smiled politely while calculating the cost of defiance and finding it acceptable. Humanity did not crave their approval, and we certainly did not fear their disapproval. Their final message arrived as a decree read aloud across the networks. It was the language of empire distilled into cold formality. They ordered the dismantling of our defenses, the surrender of our outposts, and the transfer of specified resources under penalty of corrective enforcement. The words were delivered without hesitation, as though the matter had already been decided. They thought history would record this moment as the Council's inevitable victory over another stubborn upstart. But for us, it was the line drawn in unbroken steel. Every human who heard that transmission knew instinctively that we had been given a choice: bend the knee or rise, as something no one in that chamber had anticipated. The Council mistook our restraint for helplessness, our patience for submission. They did not see that the storm they had stirred was one that would break them before it ever broke us. That ultimatum, delivered with so much arrogance, was not the beginning of our subjugation. It was the mistake that would echo across the stars, the spark that lit the fire they could never contain. They believed they had found another subject to fold into their hierarchy. In truth, they had awakened predators who had spent centuries learning the price of survival. What was coming would not be the routine enforcement they expected. It would be the lesson that changed the Council forever. The decree that demanded our surrender did not break us, it hardened us. Across colonies and stations, the words were replayed again and again, not as a warning but as a challenge. For the Council, it was a routine act of governance. For us, it was an insult too deep to ignore. Every broadcast seeded defiance. Where the Council expected fear, they found resolve, and where they expected division, they encountered unity forged in indignation. In public squares, on encrypted channels, and through quiet exchanges between workers and soldiers, a single truth spread: humanity would not yield. The message took root not because of slogans or speeches, but because the people already knew what submission would mean. We had endured too much to exchange one form of hardship for another. The Council thought themselves masters of intimidation, but intimidation works only on those unfamiliar with loss. Humanity had been intimate with loss for millennia. The Council's response to our defiance was predictably arrogant. They convened their own assemblies, spoke in clipped tones about the necessity of making an example, and treated the matter as a formality. To them, enforcement was never in doubt, only the method. Their analysts dismissed our protests as noise, and their strategists drafted plans for what they called a calibrated intervention. They believed precision strikes and selective pressure would cow us into compliance without wasting resources. The idea that their threats might awaken something far worse never crossed their minds. What they could not see was the quiet work already underway. Our governments, fractured in many matters, aligned seamlessly when the threat turned external. Scientists who had been competitors collaborated as if they had been waiting for this moment. Veterans whispered hard lessons into the ears of new recruits. Inventors stripped the protective shells off experimental projects, declaring them ready not for testing but for deployment. What looked to outsiders like disorganization was, in truth, the organized chaos of a species that had always thrived in crisis. Our strength was never in raw firepower measured against alien armadas. We knew their fleets dwarfed ours in tonnage, in sheer numerical superiority, in centuries of experience navigating war on a galactic stage. But numbers had never been the only metric of survival. Human survival was written in ingenuity, in the ability to see patterns others ignored, in finding strength in places no one else thought to look. When the Council calculated the probability of resistance, their models failed to account for this. Technology was not our only weapon. History itself was a resource. In the archive of our struggles lay the memory of improvisation under pressure, armies that survived winters meant to kill them, cities rebuilt after being burned to ash, populations that clawed their way back from disease and famine. The resilience coded into our story became the foundation for preparation. We did not romanticize hardship, we weaponized it. The Council underestimated the unity that threat could inspire. Their species had long since traded struggle for comfort, security for stagnation. They assumed division would paralyze us. Instead, those very divisions collapsed under the weight of a common danger. Human leaders stopped arguing over borders and began drawing strategies that spanned entire planets. Rival corporations shared secrets of design and logistics. Even ordinary citizens began to contribute, not out of obligation but out of a fierce belief that the choice before us was survival or extinction. When Council agents attempted espionage, they reported back only what they could see: modest fleets, scattered defenses, a society outwardly too young to stand against an empire. What they could not penetrate were the underground networks, the hidden manufactories, the encrypted chains of communication that hummed beneath the surface. They saw factories and assumed they produced tools for trade. They did not imagine those same facilities were building the scaffolds of weapons designed to turn Council doctrines into obsolete footnotes. Every move the Council made in arrogance gave us more time. Every threat they issued without following through bought us another day of preparation. They thought hesitation was mercy. In truth, it was opportunity. Our people did not waste it. Engineers tested countermeasures against their known weapon signatures. Strategists studied alien battle doctrines with clinical precision. Anthropologists analyzed their cultures, learning how to twist psychology into advantage. Farmers studied soil and climate, ensuring food reserves could outlast blockades. Every stratum of society bent toward a singular purpose, ensuring that humanity's first true war among the stars would not be its last. The Council still believed they were writing the script of our submission. They were blind to the fact that, with every order they issued, we were authoring an entirely different story. The arrogance of ancient species made them deaf to the quiet hum of preparation, the whispers of coordination, the sharpening of minds and machines. To them, we remained an immature race of colonists, an afterthought on the galactic stage. But beneath that dismissive gaze, the forge was burning, and the steel of defiance was being shaped. What they saw as noise was the overture of a storm. What they mistook for weakness was patience turning into resolve. Humanity was not posturing for recognition, nor bargaining for mercy. We were preparing, silently, methodically, for the day the Council would come to collect on its ultimatum. When that day arrived, we would be ready, not because we had greater numbers, not because we had more powerful fleets, but because we had something they no longer understood, the will to endure at any cost, and the refusal to ever kneel. For the Council, conflict was formula. Their fleets advanced in practice patterns, their doctrines refined by centuries of predictable opponents. They expected us to resist clumsily, to scatter under superior firepower, to collapse once their pressure was applied. They had no concept of the doctrine humanity carried within us, a doctrine born not from tradition but from necessity, one that shaped every decision and every strike. It was the mindset of the apex predator. Humans had never been the largest, the strongest, or the fastest on our homeworld. Our place was earned not through raw strength, but through strategy, coordination, and persistence. We stalked prey larger than ourselves, learned patience from hunger, and turned vulnerability into tools. That instinct had never left us, it simply evolved with our technology. The Council thought of warfare as mathematics. We treated it as survival, where the only equation that mattered was endurance until the enemy broke. Our training reflected that truth. Soldiers were not molded to follow rigid procedures but to think, adapt, and innovate under pressure. They drilled in chaos, not order, rehearsing the collapse of plans and the improvisation that followed. Each unit could fragment and still function, like the shards of shattered glass cutting in every direction. The Council expected enemies to crumble when command chains failed. Humanity taught every fighter to be both student and commander, hunter and prey, until no collapse could silence the fight. Technology served this doctrine with precision. Instead of massive weapons designed for intimidation, we built tools that shifted shape mid-battle. Our drones learned patterns within seconds, adjusting flight paths to exploit weaknesses in alien formations. Armor was layered with adaptive materials that hardened or softened in response to energy signatures, confusing the targeting systems designed to read predictable defenses. Even the simplest projectile was paired with deceptive trajectories, feints calculated to overwhelm sensors trained on straight-line logic. What we lacked in scale, we compensated with unpredictability, forcing the Council to fight an enemy they could never categorize. But machines were only part of the arsenal. Our true strength lay in the psychological battlefield. Stories were weapons sharpened as carefully as blades. Propaganda did not aim at their governments but at the soldiers in their fleets. Carefully placed transmissions whispered of defeats before they happened, seeded doubt in minds unaccustomed to fear, and spread the legend of humans as predators who never stopped hunting. Every intercepted signal magnified that myth, until Council crews hesitated at shadows, unsure if they were facing truth or carefully crafted illusion. The first small clashes demonstrated the doctrine in motion. A Council scout vessel approached a human outpost with confidence born of routine enforcement. Minutes later, its systems collapsed under a swarm of decoys that mimicked the signals of larger fleets, drawing its defenses in every direction at once. By the time the crew realized they had been deceived, the ship was disabled without a single direct assault. Another incursion found its supply lines shredded by sabotage too precise to be random. Bridges collapsed, engines froze, ammunition depots sabotaged by hands that moved unseen. The Council had prepared for open combat. Instead, they faced 1,000 hidden knives. Disbelief was their first reaction. Reports of failure were dismissed as errors, officers disciplined for incompetence, commanders warned not to exaggerate. But as defeats multiplied, disbelief shifted into something unfamiliar, dread. The Council had always been the hunter. Now, for the first time, they felt what it meant to be hunted. The doctrine became clear even to them, though they had no name for it. Humanity operated not as prey but as apex predators, cooperative yet ruthless, unpredictable yet precise, restrained until provoked and unstoppable once unleashed. We did not need to dominate the galaxy. We only needed to prove that those who threatened us would pay a price far greater than they could bear. That principle became the foundation of every maneuver, every strike, every word broadcast across the stars. The Council had thought survival was guaranteed by power measured in fleets and firepower. Humanity taught them that survival belonged to those who adapted fastest, who endured longest, who turned every disadvantage into a trap. What the Council failed to understand until too late was that the game had shifted. They were no longer arbiters of order, but prey stumbling in unfamiliar terrain. Humanity had revealed itself not as the fragile newcomers they expected, but as predators who had waited patiently, sharpening teeth in silence. The ultimatum that had once sounded like law now rang hollow against the doctrine of a species that had never learned to bow. The Council began their enforcement with the certainty of an empire that had never truly been challenged. Their fleets advanced with ritualized precision, ships forming immaculate lines across the void, weapons primed for demonstrations designed to inspire terror. The first strikes were not intended to annihilate us but to humble us. An outpost silenced, a convoy destroyed, a planetary defense grid surgically disabled. They expected that after a handful of examples, humanity would understand its place and surrender without further resistance. Yet the strikes did not break us. Each loss hardened resolve, each display of power confirmed what we already knew: compromise was impossible. What they believed to be a warning was instead a catalyst. Our people absorbed the blows, studied them in detail, and used every scar as information. Within days, counters were drafted, and within weeks, those counters became weapons that nullified the very doctrines meant to suppress us. The Council's calculations assumed linear resistance. They prepared for panic, disarray, and collapse. Instead, they encountered adaptation at a speed that defied their models. A weapon that succeeded once failed on the second attempt. A tactic that forced retreat one day triggered a deadly ambush the next. Their commanders, raised in traditions of predictable victory, found themselves paralyzed by an enemy that learned faster than they could adjust. Human responses were not measured in fleet size, but in unpredictability. Small craft disappeared into asteroid belts, re-emerging to strike at vulnerable supply vessels. Sabotage erupted in ports the Council believed secure, where hidden hands dismantled critical infrastructure overnight. Communications were intercepted, altered, and turned against them. Crews began receiving warnings of their own deaths before battles even began, psychological blows that fractured confidence more effectively than weapons fire. The turning point came when one of their flagships, a vessel considered untouchable, was disabled not through direct combat but through exploitation of its own systems. Human engineers discovered flaws in the resonance patterns of its shields and unleashed a precisely timed barrage of miscalibrated pulses. What should have been harmless interference became a cascading failure that left the ship powerless, drifting while human forces encircled it. For the first time, a Council symbol of supremacy was left exposed, and the myth of invincibility was broken. From that moment, momentum shifted. Council fleets still outnumbered ours, still outgunned us on paper, but the psychological terrain had changed. Their crews hesitated, their commanders questioned orders, and their formations faltered under pressure they had never faced before. Humanity's attacks grew bolder, synchronized across systems with coordination that suggested far greater strength than actually existed. Perception became weapon, and perception was enough. None of this came without cost. Human ships burned, colonies endured blockades, and lives were lost in every confrontation. Yet even in loss, we found strength. Each fallen vessel became proof of sacrifice willingly made, each scarred settlement a reminder that surrender was never an option. The Council interpreted casualties as weakening, we interpreted them as fuel. Every loss deepened the conviction that victory was not just possible but necessary. The Council had thought themselves teachers, administering lessons of order to unruly pupils. Instead, they found themselves in classrooms of their own making, students forced to learn what it meant to fight an enemy that would not break. They discovered that our greatest weapon was not any single technology or tactic but the refusal to accept defeat. Even cornered, humanity fought with the persistence of predators that had learned long ago that survival required relentless pursuit. As engagements multiplied, the balance of power no longer reflected the raw size of fleets, but the will of those who commanded them. For the first time in their long history, the Council recognized that their adversary could not be subdued by force alone. What began as enforcement had spiraled into a war they had never anticipated. The humans they expected to discipline were rewriting the rules of conflict before their eyes. The turning point was not marked by a single decisive battle but by a shift in perception. From that moment forward, the Council no longer advanced with unshakable confidence. They advanced with caution, with fear whispering at the edges of their commands, with the awareness that every engagement risked humiliation. Humanity had seized the initiative, and with it, the role of predator. What followed would not be a struggle for recognition, but for survival on a scale the galaxy had never seen. The war that the Council had envisioned as a swift correction dragged on until even their most loyal members questioned its worth. Fleets that had once traveled with ceremonial grandeur now moved with hesitation, wary of hidden traps, unsure if their numbers offered protection or made them larger targets. Every encounter drained not only resources but confidence. They discovered that humanity did not measure victory in territory seized but in will sustained, and by that measure, we had already surpassed them. After the fall of their flagship, negotiations became a whispered possibility, though none dared speak of them openly. Pride shackled their leadership, but fear gnawed at the edges of their authority. Worlds loyal to the Council watched their protectors stumble and began to doubt the certainty of their rule. Species long subdued by intimidation noticed the cracks forming and wondered if rebellion was no longer suicide. The myth of invincibility unraveled, thread by thread, until the Council itself could no longer ignore it. Humanity understood the moment. To overreach would turn survival into conquest, and conquest was never our aim. We sought recognition, not empire, respect, not domination. Our broadcasts carried a simple message, repeated across channels the Council could not silence: sovereignty is not negotiable, and restraint is not weakness. These words carried more power than weapons because they struck at the heart of the illusion the Council had built. For centuries, they claimed their rule maintained order. Humanity showed the galaxy that their order was only enforced compliance, and compliance collapsed the moment defiance proved possible. Treaties followed, not offered as gifts but demanded as conditions. Trade routes were reopened under terms of equality, not tribute. The embargoes were lifted, but not as favors granted, only as admissions of defeat. The Council agreed to boundaries that had once seemed inconceivable: recognition of human sovereignty, limitations on their intervention, and acknowledgement that we would chart our own path without their oversight. It was not a surrender in name, but in substance it was exactly that. Yet victory was not celebration. Our colonies bore scars that could not be erased. Ships drifted in ruins across contested systems, monuments to lives given for survival. Families counted empty places where loved ones had stood. We did not emerge unscathed, and that truth anchored us against arrogance. The Council had been broken, but not destroyed, and the galaxy remained dangerous. Triumph did not mean safety, it meant vigilance. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The galaxy now viewed humanity differently. No longer were we the backwater species assumed too fragile to endure. We had become the example whispered in strategy halls, the case study analyzed by generals, the warning cited by rulers considering oppression. To challenge humanity now required calculation of a cost too high to bear. That reputation alone was as powerful as any fleet, for it reshaped how others approached us. Respect achieved through fear was fragile, but respect born of demonstrated resilience was enduring. In the aftermath, we faced a choice: to turn our strength outward and pursue dominance, or to remain what we had always been, survivors unwilling to bow. We chose the latter, not because conquest was beyond us, but because survival had always been the truest expression of our nature. We did not seek to rule the galaxy, we sought to ensure no one could dictate our fate again. That was the essence of the doctrine the Council had failed to understand. Predators do not hunt for sport, they hunt because they must, and once the threat is gone, they return to silence. The lesson echoed beyond us. Species once silent under Council rule began to speak with new voices. Some sought alliances with us, others simply demanded the same recognition we had carved for ourselves. The balance of power shifted, slowly at first, then irreversibly. The Council remained, but its authority no longer resembled what it once was. Where they had spoken with unquestioned dominance, they now spoke with caution, knowing the memory of their defeat lingered over every word. For humanity, the victory was more than survival. It was the unveiling of identity on a galactic stage. We had shown that patience should never be mistaken for weakness, that cooperation does not mean submission, and that resilience is the most dangerous weapon of all. We did not need to proclaim ourselves rulers. The galaxy now understood we were predators who chose restraint, and that choice carried more weight than conquest ever could. The ultimatum that was meant to humble us became the turning point that defined us. In believing they could bully us into obedience, the Council revealed to the galaxy what we had always known, that when cornered, when pushed, when threatened with extinction, humanity would not bend. We would endure, we would adapt, and in the end, we would prevail, not because we desired to dominate, but because we were never meant to be prey.